everyone. Welcome to our DP Discover HR compliance update, where we will be going over the salary threshold increase that was released at the end of April, discuss that overtime ruling, and all of the variety of considerations that go into it. I am Jennica Watt. I'm a Boost HR advisor here at Dominion Payroll, and I'm with Josh Ard, who is our Director of Business Development for Boost HR and DP Assist. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Jennica, good morning.
Good morning.
All right. Well, I guess what we'll do is we'll go ahead and jump in. If anybody has any questions, during the webinar, feel free to insert them into the chat, and we'll do our best to address those throughout the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, thank you for attending.
Yeah. So I think if you want to take us through kind of what we'll be covering and the agenda that we have for today.
Sure. Let's go ahead and get on it. Okay, what we'll do, and I know that this is a topic that is a very vast topic and is difficult to cover in the time that we have today, but our objective is just to give a general overview, because we want to make sure that everyone on the call is aware of the pending change coming first in July 1st this year, and then a tiered approach that will happen second in January 1st of 2025. But we'll just have a brief overview. We won't be able to cover, all the unique, I guess, nuances that may be included in this law, but as a general presentation, I think that this will cover most of the employers on the call. But
I think it's
first
great
off,
to
we'll
kind
just
of
we'll
have
go
that
over a few.
baseline. Yeah, I think it's great to have that baseline, like you said, applicable to almost all employers. And then
Mhm.
if you need to dive deeper, that can happen at a later date. We're happy to talk.
Sure. It's anticipated that this will affect approximately 4 million employees, and we also think that there may be some residual effect for other employees due to the changes that may happen with those 4 million. So
Yeah.
we'll briefly cover a few key terms. We'll briefly cover just the exempt, non-exempt. That's kind of a refresher. We found out that that's a widely misunderstood topic in the years that we've been consulting in HR, and so we want to make sure that you do understand that before going forward. And we'll talk about what exactly is changing and what dates to be on the lookout for those pending changes. And then lastly, we'll touch on how to prepare or things to consider right now as you prepare for the first change that is set for July 1st. A few key terms to know. This is, I think, back in 2016 when the first exempt, non-exempt regulation came out, and it was actually, interestingly enough, it was canceled, I think, within a week of implementation. So we know that there's, a lot of appeals that will be happening in courts from employers. The Chamber of Commerce, United States Chamber of Commerce, has also issued a recent opinion on this, saying that it's not employer friendly, which actually did prompt the stay of this regulation back in 2016. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming weeks. But just as a general rule, exempt and non-exempt is confusing just by the title. But a short or an easy way that we remember it is exempt from overtime or non-exempt from overtime. And another key point to mention too is we find talking to clients that there's a misunderstanding to where our executives will think that, all exempt employees are salary, or all non-exempt employees are hourly. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. You can actually have a non-exempt employee be salaried and still be eligible for overtime. So just want to, keep that in mind as we go through the slides. But
Are
the
there
FLSA is the Fair Labor Standards Act. That is the law under the Department of Labor that we're making an adjustment to. So that's what we'll be talking about today. It is a federal law. That's going to be our focus. Of course, there's state mandates also that may be applicable in your respective state, and that will be independent of what we're talking about today. So be conscious of your state mandates wherever you wherever you have employees. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be corporately located in one state. It's wherever you have employees, maybe working remotely in other states. So be conscious of that and how those state overtime laws may apply there.
And Josh,
Um,
sorry to interject, is that an example of when a non-exempt could, like a salaried non-exempt employee could be eligible for overtime, is when some of those state rules come into play? You know, for example, if it's not, you're not looking at the full 40-hour week, some states break it down a little smaller, don't they?
oh, exactly right. I mean, if you just take California, for example, you have daily overtime. So that would
Mm-hmm.
actually run parallel to the federal regulation. Now, in California, as an example, that is going to be more strict than the federal mandate. So you could actually follow the state mandate and be okay.
And is
But
that a good general rule? Is if the state mandate is more strict, more stringent than the federal, that you err towards the more stringent?
Yes, very, very good question. And with most employment law on the state level, a lot of times states will adopt or just, follow the federal, guidelines, whatever that law may be. And when we're talking about wage and hour laws, most states actually adhere to the federal standard for overtime. However, there are states out there that are far more strict than the federal regulations. So it would be suggested that you would follow the more strict of the two. And most times that will ensure that you're meeting compliance on both the state and the federal level.
That makes total sense. But as far as I can remember, it's just a few. So it's, we hate to make a blanket statement, but it's
Mhm.
just a few states. So it's, make sure you're checking. But the majority of states, you will end up with that federal ruling.
Yes, for the most part, most states do adopt that federal ruling, but make sure, especially with remote
Right.
employees, even if you have one, two, or just a handful of employees in other states, make sure that you're, aware of what the state guidelines for overtime are.
Absolutely. And
Very
for
good.
that FLSA, does that apply to all employers, regardless of size, or are there any sort of considerations to keep in mind in terms of eligibility for these FLSA rulings?
Yes, in general, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which governs wage and hour law, is going to apply to a large majority of all employers. Now, there will be a few very unique exceptions, but they aren't very likely. So how we like to talk to clients is just assume this does apply to you until we can go through a further analysis and determine that it doesn't.
Right, you have to be very, very small in order to be an exception, or like you said, a very unique business.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yes, very
absolutely.
unique industry. And
Awesome.
when we're talking about overtime too, we're always looking at it on a what we refer to or what the FLSA refers to as a work week.
Mhm.
And that's any 7 day period. And most times you will find that employers choose a Sunday to Saturday or a Friday to Thursday, something of the sort. But it can be any period of 7 days, but it has to include that 7 day period to determine, are there any hours worked in excess of 40 hours for that work week?
So that's what okay, that makes sense.
Good
Um,
deal.
yeah, and I think if we could dive a little bit more into that yeah, here we go, exempt versus non-exempt, that would be great.
Yes, and this is something, and like I said earlier, it's been a really hard concept for employers to pick up over the years. There was an attempt back in 2016 to adjust the salary threshold, but it was stayed in the courts and ended up changing in 2020. So it's been about 4.5 years since the most recent change. But we still find that employers struggle with just, you know, defining what is exempt, what is non-exempt, because it's, to be perfectly honest, it's not the easiest analysis. It seems simple on the surface, but there's a lot that goes into it. So,
I feel like
just
when most people get that snafu, it's that duties test, that like responsibilities,
yes,
right? I feel
that's
like that's where
exactly
people
right.
really get tripped up.
That's exactly right. Or try to force, an employee into a certain category that they may not, fit into legally. So it's, just looking at non-exempt employees first. Non-exempt employees are typically going to be your hourly employees, and we all know that if anybody is compensated at an hourly rate, then they're going to be eligible for overtime. And also earn at least minimum wage. That's another part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And when they do work in excess of that 40 hours within the work week, then they will be eligible for 1.5 times their hourly rate of pay for that time worked in excess of 40.
In that
Now,
7-day work week.
that's right, that's right.
Yeah.
And exempt is when it gets a little more complicated. You know, an exempt employee, there's several categories that we'll talk about. That what Jennica mentioned is the duties test. So not only is there one part that is how you're compensated, whether that's salary or hourly, how much is your salary annually, but then there's also a duties test that must be passed for an employee to be, determined exempt. So I think that's when it gets a little complicated, and that's what we've received a lot of requests from our current clients about just assistance with doing this analysis to see who's going to be affected, and what changes do we need to make going forward.
Absolutely. And I see you do have that the new or the existing numbers on here, correct? Is that what these numbers are?
Yes. So currently, these are the existing numbers to for the salary threshold. So we're looking at $684 per week, or which is equivalent to 35,568 annually.
And then
This
we'll
is
touch on what it will be coming up
sure.
later in the slides. Okay.
Yes, yes. And this is the part that's going to be changing. The duties test is not necessarily going to be changing, but the salary threshold is the significant change that could potentially be happening on July 1st.
And I think that's probably something that people might lose sight of when all the focus is on this salary threshold change is that that duties piece is still a major factor. Just because you change, the salary doesn't mean that you don't have to pay attention to what those responsibilities are. That is still one of those three criteria.
You're exactly right. It's and we found too that people just get focused on that salary threshold, thinking that that's all that they would need to surpass to make an employee exempt. But you're right, Jenica. It's the whole picture. So you actually have to look at the duties, and if they do not meet the requirements of those specific six categories, then they will be deemed non-exempt and eligible for overtime.
Perfect.
And we
If
can
yeah, I mean, if we could dive a little bit more into that duties piece of things, the responsibilities.
Sure, sure. And this is kind of reiterating what you were mentioning too,
Oh,
that
perfect.
yeah, and it's I think it's critical for everybody to understand that point that you brought up, that it's a three-part test. It's a salary basis test, and then also salary level test, and then a duties test. So all three of these aspects, an employee would have to meet to be eligible or exempt from overtime.
Perfect. And then
Yes.
what do you have at the bottom there for the white collar exemption?
So the white collar exemption is what they commonly refer to as the group of exemption categories. So that, is sort of a generic term that's been used for years. But what that means is, you can, if you do meet the salary, if you are compensated at a salary rate, and if you meet that threshold, which, like we talked about, is 35,000 now, which will be increasing, potentially on July 1st. But to qualify for the white collar exemption, an employee must meet the salary basis test, a salary level test, and the duties test. Job titles or salary wages alone do not determine exemption status.
Oh, yeah, you're right, because that is something that we hear from a lot of clients is their understanding is that a supervisor or a manager automatically puts them into that category, but it's not about the title whatsoever. It is about those actual roles and responsibilities, correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. You could start with a salaried employee, but part two of that test is that salary level test. So, are they surpassing that threshold to give them the eligibility for exemption? Um, and are they currently above the threshold now, but could potentially be below the threshold once we see this increase? Um, so the salary level test is used to ensure that the employee meets the minimum specified amount to qualify for the exemption. The threshold provides employers with an objective and efficient way to determine whether the employee qualifies for that white collar exemption.
Right, right. And if you could, we'll click to that next slide because I think it'll be really telling for people to see that listed out there of what those might be. Because it's the executive, administrative, and professional, correct? Those EAP that people might have heard that term.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the EAP does, like Jenica's saying, refers to the executive, administrative, and professional.
Will you
Um,
click to that next slide for me? Because I think you have it listed on the next one.
yeah, sure thing.
Yeah,
And you'll
perfect.
hear these exemptions referred to as EAP, which does stand for executive, administrative, and professional. But there's actually a few more, but they're commonly referred to as the EAP exemptions. But you also have outside sales personnel that could qualify as exempt if they were in the field for 51% of the time. You have certain computer employees, is how they refer to them, certain people in IT that may qualify as exempt. And, just a side note there, that the reason they would be exempt is a person that had a critical role in IT may be expected to do work after hours in the event that there was a system issue that they may have to address. So knowing that, would make it very difficult to track hours because they have to be available at all times. And then, lastly, the highly compensated employees. There's also an exemption for highly competent employees, and this threshold is also going to be increasing on July 1st. And this one is, I have a note here at the bottom too, because over the years when we've been consulting with our clients, it's these are actually very difficult to meet. I would say that the executive exemption or management exemption is most common, because if you manage two or more employees, and then also meet the salary requirements, then you could be deemed exempt. Um, Now, when it comes to administrative is not what it seems. As the term administrative, we may think of an admin or clerical position, but this is incorrectly defined in my opinion. But administrative would be someone that can make business level decisions on their own, just as a short way to put it. But the administrative exemption is very difficult to meet. So just keep that in mind.
And I would definitely use, he included the fact sheet on here, but they provide some really good examples online, especially for that administrative one, because you're right, that is one that people think uh, would include a lot of different employees, and it's actually more difficult than you would imagine. So yeah, if you go online there, they do have some really good examples, and that can guide you, so you don't fall prey to that thinking.
Yes, that's exactly right. Because we'll find that clients are, trying to sometimes force an employee into a particular category, but make sure that you're doing your due diligence and making sure they do actually meet the definition for that respective
Yeah,
category. You know, because you will need to show proof of that. You know, in the event that you were questioned about it.
yeah. So you did mention that it's going to be a tiered change, um, and that first change is July 1, correct?
Yes. So right now we have the potential change, and I say potential because it's even though a final ruling has been issued by the Department of Labor, then there's a lot of employers, a lot of industry associations, chambers that are pushing back against this because of the great, or excuse me, because of the inconvenience that it's going to cause
Hmm.
employers. That this is going to be a big deal for employers, because they're going to have to spend significant time, on their analyses of who does this affect within my workforce, and what do we do if somebody was exempt and now they're non-exempt. So there's a lot of discussion around this, which is going to be, very costly for the employer. And then, changes if they have to start to pay an employee who was, traditionally not eligible for overtime, but now is, then it could be a significant cost increase, for employers as well. So
Even
it's
even with the training piece, I mean, we're thinking about why they might tier this system or kind of stagger this. Costs, like you said, is definitely a factor, but even the procedure way that you're rolling this out to employees who may, not be in the habit of clocking in and out or tracking their hours. There's, like you said, there's a lot of time and work that needs to go into this change. Um,
yes, and
so at least you kind of practice with that lower number, and then you can, once that's decided for a later date, how much of that salary increase change there will be, you'll already hopefully have this process in place, right? Is that kind of
yes,
how you're thinking about it?
yeah, I would totally agree. Even though that this could potentially be stayed prior to July 1st, we recommend that, you know, proper preparation is going to be best for every employer. You want to know how this is going to affect your company, how
Hmm.
each employee is going to be affected, because, what makes it difficult is you could have different outcomes for different employees, based on how much they're compensated, what they actually do at work. So it's going to be, once you determine what employees are going to be affected, you're going to have to go through each employee one by one to determine, okay, are we going to, change their classification from exempt to non-exempt? Um, do we even know how much time they've been working because they haven't been clocking in, having been exempt in the past? And like you say, Jenica, I think that that's a really significant part of it, because you may have to start, or you will have to start tracking time for those who traditionally have not tracked time, because there really is no other way to determine if they are working overtime if we don't have a time record.
Yeah, and this we did have a question come in. We may not be able to dive fully into it, but if you just have kind of a high level answer, we had a question about whether these thresholds that we're talking about are total comp or if it's just that salary. Does it include bonuses or things like that? And my understanding is that it is total comp, correct?
It is that is, you're right. That's kind
It's
of
a
a
bigger
loaded question.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, because we see this most often when you will have, say, someone in sales be paid a lower salary but be incentivized by a commission structure.
Hmm.
And what I would, in looking at this in prior years, they would only let you use a portion of commissions, because
Okay.
commissions will obviously fluctuate. So we want to use total comp, but we may have to look historically, what has this employee earned, over an extended period of time? Is it
Got it.
consistent or does it fluctuate? So I think that's that's something that we can dive a little further into, and maybe we can reach out with, some more detailed
Some additional.
guidance,
Yeah.
following this. But that's a very
Yeah.
good
I mean, it's a great question, something that you will have to dive into because even with all of that, there's those caveats of discretionary, non-discretionary, and all of those
question.
things. So we will follow up with some additional information for that question. I don't want to get us too off topic, but I thought that was an interesting one that came in.
No, and that's another example of, for the most part, it seems, simple to interpret on the surface, but that is just a prime example of one of the unique areas that there has been guidance issued in the past, and we're also in the period right now where guidance is being developed, by the
Right.
Department of Labor to, for these specific instances, how is this to be treated? Because don't you know that there is a lot of pushback, from employers and how they're supposed to treat these unique situations. So that's an excellent example.
And as we move to the next slide, talking about the January 1st change, I do just want to highlight on this slide and the next one, we also have a blurb about the highly compensated employees. And that again, just because we're going to run short on time, I would recommend going to that fact sheet that Josh had linked, and you can find on their website. But it does list examples that you can refer to when you're trying to figure out those HCEs and not. But I just wanted to touch on those kind of as we're moving through here.
Yeah, but perfect point too. And there's one thing I'll say about, highly compensated employees, because I get this question a lot is, the it's potentially going to increase to 151, 164 annually. So, and I've had people ask me that, well, why somebody making that much money is not going to be eligible for overtime? Well, unfortunately, they could be. Somebody that could make $150,000 a year if they do not meet the duties test, they could be potentially eligible for overtime. And I know that's kind of that's hard to grasp. That's
Yeah.
even hard for me to say out loud, but that's the way that the law is interpreted. So, be conscious of that highly comp salary threshold increase also.
I think that's a great point. Yeah. And then for this January 1 date, 2025, kind of what are the considerations with that one? I know it's a little ways out and we still have this July 1, but what's your thought process there? What should we be considering?
So what, and great question, Jenica. What we're hearing from the legal minds is, the increase that is potentially scheduled for, or that is scheduled for July 1st, is actually just a continuation of the same percentage increases that they used in 2020.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing is this is less likely to be stayed. Not to say that it won't. We're not going to make any guarantees there, but the increase that is happening 6 months after that is another 30% increase. So this is a very significant step up from where we are now at 35, going to 58, 856 or
Hmm.
656, excuse me. And I think that if there were any pushback that would be effective in the courts, then we could potentially see a change to what is scheduled for January 1st, more so than July 1st change.
Right. Right. That makes total sense. Um, and then, so
And
I think, yeah, go for it.
one other thing too, Jenica, just to mention too before we go forward is something that you may want to consider is, as you're preparing for this July 1st date,
Mhm.
you and doing your analysis to determine, who is going to be affected and what are we going to do with these employees? We're going to change their classifications, increase their pay, have them start tracking time. There's multiple options, but you may want to go ahead and look at the second increase while you're doing your
Mhm.
analysis, because otherwise you're going to find yourself potentially in the same boat, having to go through that same process in 4 or 5 months.
Well, and another thing to consider, and what we've been talking through our HR consulting, our Boost clients, is just what you said. Look at both of those changes you don't want to make the change for July 1, find yourself with some compression and not have a greater plan for the larger number of employees that would be affected on January 1. So yeah, I mean, get that snapshot of where you are now and plan, action for July 1, but have that strategy in place for both shifts so that it's not just in a vacuum, that July 1 change. Because this could just be the push you need to kind of dedicate time to that comp planning and that strategy, and get yourself on that right trajectory for planning for those increases. If obviously we'll discuss there are different options to take, but if you're looking to increase those salaries and meet that threshold, I completely agree. Like not discounting that January 1 date yet.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um,
So,
okay. And then there was a one other piece to this change, correct? There's
and you're referring to, yes, yes, exactly
yes.
right. This is something that's sort of following the schedule, coming from the 2020 change, albeit that was, about 4.5 years ago. But part of this mandate or part of this regulation would be that there would be automatic increases every 3 years. Now,
Okay.
I think that this is a significant part of it that we need to be conscious of, but I'm curious to see how this is going to work out, because let's just say that we move past the July 1st salary threshold, the deadline, and then people make changes. Well, that's obviously going to move a lot of employees from exempt status to non-exempt status. So I'm curious to see how that's going to affect the percentages of the national workforce that they're aiming for. Is because we're
Right.
going to be looking at different metrics, as these changes occur and as employees shift from exempt to non-exempt. So you could, if you're looking at 35% of the workforce and trying to move them to a non-exempt status, then, what does that mean in 3 years?
Right.
We're going to be using a different equation with different numbers.
Yeah, that's a great point. You kind of lose sight of that there is at the base of all this, there is an equation that they're working from, percentages that they're working from. Um,
Hmm.
and they do list those, but it's good in terms of that greater thinking and planning to look at what that approach is. And you can kind of anticipate a little bit, but like you said, it will shift.
Hmm. Yes, because
Um,
we're going to be looking at different, our exempt and then non-exempt groups of employees nationwide are going to be significantly different, potentially, after the first of the year in 2025.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, but I know we have a really important slide next, but we did have somebody come in just as we're talking about that non-exempt exempt. You know,
Mhm.
could you talk a bit about just like the benefits of each? When people are kind of thinking about whether they're making the changes to their employee base or how they're communicating that, like, what are those pros and cons a little bit, if just, a little higher levels for time's sake.
Yeah, it's this is when you kind of get into the weeds. This is when it gets a little complicated because, like I mentioned earlier, you could have different outcomes for each employee in your company. As
Right,
to are we going to change them to non-exempt? Non-exempt, and I think, backing up a little bit, I think that this came about, and I think it was a benefit for, if you looked at, back in 2016, if you looked at retail managers, that could potentially be pulling 60 hours a week and maybe even 70 hours a week during peak seasons. If they managed more than two or more people, then they were considered exempt at the time. So you could have a retail manager making thirty to $50,000 annually, and not be paid overtime for any of those hours worked over 40. And so I think that it's appealing there, and maybe well deserved there. If you look at other industries such as the medical industry, it, all nurses, assistants, a majority of positions in the medical field prefer hourly pay. They prefer to be on that non-exempt status, even though some of them could actually be professionally exempted. So it how you position that to your employees, because this will inevitably affect morale. So
Hmm.
you're going to have to be delicate with your delivery, to each employee about these changes. On one side of things, you can leverage your decisions and say that, hey, this is a significant change that the Department of Labor is making, and we don't have any option. We have to be compliant. And
Right.
that may help you leverage your reasoning for the changes that you have to make. But just for instance, if you've got, and we ran across this several years ago, that we had an employee that was working at a community bank for 35 years, and they had never clocked time, never had a time record because they were operating as if they were exempt. And the new regulation put them in a non-exempt status. And that caused a lot of issues with that employee because they look at that as sort of a demotion. So you don't want to position anything like that, because obviously we don't want to do anything right now in our current state of employment that's going to affect your employee morale. So you have to be very strategic on how you position this with your employees, and also try to be somewhat consistent. Because if oddly enough, a good example to use, if you had two employees that were paid relatively the same rate, but then one was going to be eligible for overtime, and if or you're aware that they're going to be working, say, 45 hours a week, you could have a situation to where that person who is non-exempt could be earning more income than the person who is exempt.
Right.
So there are a lot of scenarios to play out. So that's why we reiterate all the time that the earlier you can begin your analysis, the better, because hopefully it doesn't create too many issues for the employers on this call, but I assure you you're going to encounter some things that you have not anticipated when it comes to these changes. So take your time, do your due diligence to make sure that you fully understand, and consult with a professional if you need guidance on this.
Yeah, because it really is. It's not exempt versus non-exempt. One is good, one is bad. There are, like you said, industry-based, role-based pros and cons for each of those situations, and you really do have to look at the specific employee, the numbers, all of those different considerations. How you, like you said, finesse it, how you roll it out. That can completely change how it is received by those employees. Um, so as simple as that question seems, if I would talk about the benefits of each, it's you're right, it is a much more involved question. It's than it appears on its face.
Yeah, it's you're
Um,
exactly right. It's telling someone, and we had a lot of our clients were using this reasoning, but when they were moving or reclassifying employees and moving them from an exempt status to a non-exempt status and eligible for overtime, if you really look at it technically, it would be more favorable for the employee, right? Because that ensures that any minute worked in excess of that 40 hours, they're being compensated at time and a half.
mhm,
Um, but I'll tell you from experience, that's not how it's received
right.
from by employees. So just be very conscious of how you're delivering that message, and how you're positioning your reasoning there, because there's going to be some pushback, so you can go ahead and expect that.
But there is a way, like you said, that just have your reasoning identified. There is a way to have
Mhm.
those conversations and have those conversations go well. But you just have to do your homework and be prepared.
Yeah, no
Um,
doubt about it. I mean, it's a regulation that as an employer, you really don't have a choice not to follow. The repercussions of being found out of compliance when it comes to this particular situation or regulation are very, very serious. I think that there's the Department of Labor, in the event that they do an audit, which I participated in and or assisted an employer or client of ours last year in a Department of Labor audit, and um, they show up, knock on the door, and then ask where they can sit down. And they can actually look at time records. If they determine that somebody is improperly classified, they can go back 3 years. And if they find that overtime was otherwise due to that employee, the employer is responsible for all of that overtime or back pay, also responsible for the employer and employee taxes, payroll taxes associated with that. And that's not to even mention penalties if they find it to be willful. So
Right. Well, that's the
it's
key.
very serious.
Yeah. And ignorance is not a defense, even
No,
if it's just like a miscalculation or something, like they can, like you said, 3 years back, and that adds up, especially if there's multiple employees that are considered in
right.
this. It's not just a one-off situation. So yeah, making sure that you're compliant with this, even if you think you're getting away with it at the start, they can look back, they can do all those calculations and figure it out, and it's so much easier just to get ahead of it now and make some of these tougher decisions. But then you can be confident that you are in compliance, and not
You're
worried about.
exactly right.
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk about some tips on how to prepare in our last couple of minutes? And then, like we said, if anybody has questions, we are happy to follow up.
Yes, in preparation, like we've said several times, we think it's a benefit to start sooner than later. Just because, I think being fully aware of what this change or entails and how that's going to affect your workforce is going to put you in a position to make the best decision. And don't think that this is something that you can figure out in 30 minutes. Allow yourself more time than you would think when you get into or you undergo this analysis. But we've attached the link to the final rule and also some frequently asked questions, which are very helpful. They don't cover all instances that you may run across, but make sure you review the final guidance and the FAQs. That also there's most likely going to be some additional guidance, similar to situations when they roll out regulations in the past that it's we can all remember COVID and there were no really laws, it was just guidance. But I foresee that probably happening with this too, to where as these questions are being asked, the Department of Labor will put out resources to address those questions, or at least I'm being optimistic about that. Um, but you know, go through your current classifications, and this is something I think a good starting point is that you want to just print a report.
Yeah.
Excuse me. You want to have a report that shows a list of your employees and those that are salaried, and then how they're classified right now. Now remember, this should not affect hourly employees because they are non-exempt and they will remain non-exempt. But once you generate your report, then you can sort of see, and sort them by increasing the salary amounts, and then you can sort of see who's going to fall in this threshold, and that should be your primary focus, going, to start the analysis really.
Right. And that is one thing that you can pull directly out of iSolve for our clients. You
Hmm.
can pull kind of that salary rate list for your current employees. And it may look better than you anticipate. I worked with a client recently and we pulled that, and there was really only one employee who was in danger of that July 1 threshold, and I think maybe one or two. And it was somebody that they had already been thinking about providing a raise to. So it get a clear snapshot of where you are, no matter if you think it's going to be favorable or unfavorable. But get that's the first place to start. How can you plan if you don't know where you are right now? So that's definitely, I completely agree that that's the best practice for making these changes.
Yeah, this is certainly a situation where ignorance is not blissful. You want to make sure that you understand how this is impacting your business, and you may need to look a little further, like if you're going to be changing somebody's classification, how do you determine how much they've been working thus far? Because I think
Mhm.
what you need to you know, understand or try to get close to an understanding is how is this going to affect budget? Because really, there. I think what we've been hearing is this is going to cost a lot of employers, as far as compensation, because there will be increases that will happen. And then if you do have employees that have to limit their schedules to 40 hours, this will always also be an additional cost for employers if they have to supplement that 40 hours of that one employee, or if they have to pay overtime once they become eligible for overtime. So,
And there are, there are calculations that you can come up with kind of those neutral costs where you can adjust hourly to if you can anticipate that somebody has been working 50 hours consistently and then needs to, if you need to adjust for the overtime, you can. But you do have to think about how that will be received by the employee and what are your priorities in this moment? Is it that retention and morale of the employee base, or is it that bottom line? Um, and something that we kind of forget to think about now is also like what policies do you have in place that are eligibility is dictated by exempt, non-exempt status? How will that affect your employees? And that's obviously opening up a whole other can of worms. But I just wanted to say it now so that people's minds are kind of thinking that way, whether you have different benefits, that eligibility is based on exempt status. Um,
mhm.
Try to, if you can, try to think about all of these things in anticipation of those conversations with your employees. The more prepared you can be, the better, you know?
Yeah, that's you bring up a great point right there, talking about just looking at a neutral cost analysis or determining a rate. Say if you're going to move somebody from salary to hourly, effectively making them non-exempt and eligible for overtime. If you know that that particular employee has been working 45 hours, then you could actually take that salary and see what their hourly rate is based on 45 hours per week. Now, granted, what Jenica said there is you have to be very conscious of how the employee is going to receive that. Are they looking at a salary that's based on 40 hours? Or are they looking at a salary
Right.
based on what they're actually working at 45? So that has to be positioned very delicately, to ensure that you're not upsetting your employees.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I did we get to all of the things on this slide that we needed to talk about? I mean, obviously there are updates down the road.
Yes, yes. I think make sure that you're keeping, this is something it's a probably the hottest topic right now when it comes to HR. And I anticipate that that's only going to increase in the coming, month and a half. So this is probably something you're going to see on the news, but watch for updates. I wouldn't let it delay my analysis or, looking into this, seeing how it's going to affect the workforce, but make sure that you're watching out for updates that could change what we currently know now.
Yeah, and just one question just came in before we finish up.
Hmm.
It is if you classify an employee as non-exempt, can you have a salary level below these thresholds as long as you pay them for overtime? And I think that last phrase is that key there. As you said, non-exempt can be hourly or salary. So that
Yes.
last sentence of as long as you pay them for overtime would keep you in compliance. Am I reading that
Yeah.
correctly?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and these are some of the changes that we made back in 2020. Is we had employers that did not want to move their employees to an hourly, rate of pay as opposed to what they currently were at salary. But it is completely legal to pay an employee a salaried rate annually. And then for any time worked in excess of 40 hours per work week, they would then be paid at 1.5 times their hourly rate.
Right.
So,
Right.
make sure that, the systems that you have in place right now, or, how you're tracking that, can correctly determine what that overtime pay would be. But that is certainly legal to do. So that may be kind of it's, you'll read that it's a more of a complicated way to do things, but I almost think that it's kind of a halfway there instead of just ripping the Band-Aid and and just moving them to an hourly employee, which most employees are going to think of as, kind of a demotion. Then you could leave them at a salary, so they kind of have best of both worlds, and they'd be paid a salary and they'd be paid overtime in excess of 40 per work week.
Right, right. I mean, I completely agree. So you have a lot of options in this situation. It's
Mhm.
just you have to put yourself, think about your company, your bottom line, what your priorities are, and then think about those employees that are in danger of those changes. And you have to kind of reconcile those two things and come up with a plan. But there's not one course of action. There are multiple different ways you can get there. So you can, curate it to what you need. Um, so we do have a couple more questions, but what we will do, because we have quite a few, is we will follow up with answers to all of these as well as the recording. Um, I believe, Josh, will we be sending out the PowerPoint as well?
Yes, we will. We'll be sending out the recording, and like you say, we'll address each of the questions that came in. We'll just address them directly.
Absolutely. And if additional questions come up, do not hesitate to reach out. You can, if you get them in now on this chat, we will record them. But if it's later on and you think of something, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, Jennica Watt and Josh Ard. And you can also contact us through the main DP line or any of those emails. And we thank you for joining us today. I know this isn't the most interesting topic, but it is so relevant and it applies to so many different organizations and employees. So it's something that we just really felt that we needed to get on here and discuss. Um, so
Yes. If we can
start
be
your
of help to
planning.
anyone,
Yeah,
let us know.
absolutely. Yeah, we've got our Boost consulting services that if you're an existing uh, Dominion client or you found your way onto this webinar, feel free to reach out to inquire about those services. Um, but if even if not, we just suggest start your planning now. Try to think about all those considerations and get an idea of where you currently start, and then move forward. Yeah. Well, thank you, Josh. This is
Well,
great.
thank you too, Jenica.
Awesome. Well, everyone, have a good day.